Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Thriving in Change with Dr. Norcott. Today, I'm really excited because I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Shanta Kanukolu. She's a psychologist here in Chicago, and she works in trauma, just like me. Hi, Shanta.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so excited to reconnect. Zoom is so good for that. We haven't seen each other in a while.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful for this.
I mentioned that you also work in trauma, and we met because we were having discussions about trauma in our respective communities. We both share a community of working with individuals who are survivors, but you've kind of focused on a very specific population of women that maybe you felt haven't been centered when we've been talking about trauma, or perhaps have faced unique challenges in the trauma work. Can you share a little bit about the community that you have been drawn to and why?
So my family is from India. I'm the first generation to be born here. So I identify as South Asian. When I was in undergrad, starting to explore the world of psychology, I found there wasn't a lot of representation in terms of professors, in terms of samples, in the research projects I was reading about, in the videos, learning about psychology. There wasn't anyone that looked like me or sounded like me or had experiences like me at the time. When I moved on to grad school, I ended up doing research on the Asian American population and started to center on the South Asian population, because even within the Asian American research, I found there wasn't a whole lot of representation of people from South Asia. So I've spent the past decade or so really trying to shift this and to explore the mental health outcomes and mental health topics that are relevant to the South Asian population. And as expected, trauma affects all communities and is one that affects the South Asian community as well.
You use the word or the phrase representation matters. And that is so important in psychology, in therapy. You can still have an amazing experience with a therapist that looks different than you. But to have people talking about trauma that looks like you, I think it bridges a gap at times. Survivors can feel seen, right? Like somebody like me is talking about this very painful thing. It makes reaching out a little bit easier when it's time to reach out for help.
Absolutely. I used to work, in various settings, in the forensic setting here in Chicago or in the suburbs of Chicago. And I recently started working in the private practice setting. And I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I had always worked for some sort of institution or larger government entity. And I was shocked that within weeks of me opening up my private practice, I've had so many South Asians reach out to me. And their main reason for clicking on my profile was because they had been searching for so long for someone who looked like them. And we're so excited to find someone that looked like them. It's unfortunate that so many of us, of course, are struggling and need to seek therapy, but also such a blessing that I think we're in a place now where we're able to work together.
Absolutely. That's so powerful, but so grateful that you're there.
Oh, me too.
I think there's long been this awareness that there's some stigma around mental health, and it has kept, particularly in communities of color, it's kept people from seeking help. And so people have cited stereotypes or tropes like strong Black woman from seeing reaching out for help as being like a sign of weakness. That shame and that stigma acts uniquely through some of those tropes or controlling images, as Patricia Hill Collins called them. What are some of those unique aspects of the South Asian community that keep people from talking, or that keep that silence and shame going?
I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of overlap with the South Asian community and other communities of color. But I think, like you said, there's some specific tropes that apply to each community. And the one that comes to my mind is that of the model minority. Brown folks, specifically South Asian brown folks, are seen for years. Until recently, there's some shifts there. But they're usually the doctors, the engineers, the scientists on television, or there's a stereotype of, are you going to be in medical school, or are you going to engineering or computer science growing up, right? Like that's sort of, those are the only options, right? And so the model minority myth is positive in that there's a sense of pride in your community, sense of excitement that we're all, doing well, there's high educational attainment, lower juvenile delinquency, the socioeconomic status, perhaps. But we also know that's not true for everybody. And we also know that it's impossible that there's a perfect community like that. And what it does is it also prevents people from talking about the parts of themselves that are struggling or that have been impacted by things that are painful or traumatic. Mm-hmm. And so I think that stereotype really prevents people from being human and creates this importance on productivity and success and not being able to sort of shed that stoic exterior to reach out for help. So that's a big issue because then we end up spending years and years in that stereotype, in that shell, struggling internally.
And these identities that sound so empowering have such a dark side. Yes, I can embrace my strength. I can embrace my culture of achievement, but I can also acknowledge my humanity and my vulnerabilities. Therapy can offer that balance to people. Yeah.
Right. And the more that people aren't talking about those parts of themselves, I think more people think they shouldn't. So if someone is saying, well, so-and-so had a hard time doing this, why are you having a hard time? Right? That person is then thinking I should reach to their level of well-being when we actually don't even know what their well-being is. We're all basing it off of these myths or these masks that we're putting on.
Like what are kind of the unique aspects of doing treatment with somebody who has a South Asian identity?
I appreciate that question. I do. I think something that's important to keep in mind is that every South Asian person one might see in their practice or in their clinical setting has a different story. First, they might have different country of origin. So how did their families come here? What was their story? What was their path? I think there's a lot of assumptions therapists might place on how someone before them arrived there. But I think there are different countries that make up South Asia with different histories, religious persecution, of war, different migration stories, different discrimination and hate stories upon coming to a new country. Each family might have its own intergenerational trauma story as well. So I think keeping in mind that we need to sort of dissect all aspects of that person's family history along with their own history, I think is going to be really important because we don't know then how much of their trauma presentation is related to their own trauma or their generations of trauma that came before them.
Yeah, and likely a combination.
Correct. Absolutely.
In a previous Thriving in Change, I talked with another guest about creating a genogram. And really what that is, it's about building out the story, building out the narrative of the person that's sitting in front of you.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'll find that people who come before me actually don't even know these stories about their families when I ask them about it, because their families have been stoic as well and haven't shared it or haven't processed it. There's a lot of unmetabolized trauma that hasn't been passed down, and so verbally rather. And so it really creates a lot of questions in the room of, I don't really know that about my folks. And it's hard sometimes for them to even find that out because they'll go back and say, I don't even know how to ask my parents because they don't even know I'm in therapy. That's another piece of the puzzle, right? A lot of South Asians coming to see me, they're coming to see me in secrecy. They don't believe their families will understand it or know what to say about it. And so I think therapists also have to keep in mind that there is secrecy about trauma, but also oftentimes secrecy and even seeking help.
Yeah, I really am in awe when I come across a patient like that, because yet and still, they're still seeking and engaging in their own health and recovery.
Right. They're having to really make a shift for themselves to do that and really change learned behavior and recondition themselves to think about therapy in a way that's not a weakness, to frame vulnerability as a sign of courage as opposed to a sign of weakness,
Yeah.
And I would say that's actually a really important piece for a therapist to keep in mind too, that if they're the first people seeking therapy, seeking treatment like this, they may not know a whole lot about it. I have a lot of clients who are very educated, who present as very well-informed and really smart. But when it comes to what therapy should feel like and look like, there's a lot of gray, a lot of haziness. So I've had to explain to people many times like who I am compared to who a psychiatrist might be. what a social work degree means versus a psychology doctorate means, about how I don't prescribe medication, about what the value of talk therapy is, how consistent therapy is helpful. So really going in and assessing even the knowledge of what psychotherapy is and what it should feel like is really important, I would say. Or even thinking about the dynamic in therapy. I think a lot of South Asians, myself included, were taught to respect their elders and respect people who have a degree. But I'll have to tell clients, hey, if something I say doesn't feel good, I want you to tell me. If something I'm saying is totally off the mark, please talk to me. And they're shocked because there's this, I think, understanding that if you're the expert, you're not supposed to speak up. But that's also what a lot of survivors are told, right? Don't speak up. Something that I myself am working on is learning more about the South Asian identity and what it means to be South Asian. I, for example, have not had to think very much about caste, right? And so that is something that many people think about in India. The caste system was abolished legally in India, but is still active in the way people think about themselves and treat other people. There is a long history of caste discrimination in India. And interestingly, there was a recent case that came out of California, or I think is still going on. The first legal case based on caste discrimination in Silicon Valley is occurring, I think, as we speak. And it reminded me that as much as people have said they've left that behind, caste can be very active for people here in the US context. And so it may or may not be relevant to your client, but I think therapists need to keep that in mind, that caste might play a really big role in their clients' lives or in the way their families see themselves.
For those that don't know what caste is, can you kind of describe what it is for people that might not have heard that?
The caste system in India has a long history. It's a way in which the community is divided by maybe division of labor. These classes are and castes are given to families, and you can't grow out of it. You can't sort of have upward mobility out of it. You're born into a caste. And that caste system can really impact the jobs you get, the roles you play in your community. Some people identify it by your name, by maybe how you look, and that's problematic. And as we know, any sort of discriminatory labeling of a community is not good for so many reasons, right? And so it has prevented people from getting into colleges. It has led to strife in families in terms of intercaste marriages or how marriages are arranged. So it plays a pretty rich role in families, but we have to keep in mind not all families. There are many urban families in India that don't even think about this day to day. So there's diversity in the way it is practiced, used, and understood in India, as well as here in the immigration context. And the second thing to keep in mind too is India is a really diverse place, as is the rest of South Asia. I'm speaking, of course, more about India because that is my background that I know more about, but India has many states. Each state has a different language. India has different religions. So there's a common assumption that every Indian American that walks into your space might be Hindu, but that is not the case, right? So I think it's important for people to ask about religion, ask about their spirituality, ask about whether caste is a topic comes to play in their homes. So I think using an intersectional approach when assessing and treating and working with a South Asian client is going to be really essential.
Thank you. That's so helpful. We as therapists can make assumptions about what part of someone's identity is taking priority in their therapy, and we could be so wrong. Mm-hmm. So it's really about asking inquiring about all those different aspects of identity.
And I have to do the same, even as a South Asian woman. I have to keep that in check for myself, that I'm not placing my experience onto them. And I'm not making assumptions based on my background. So even if I have someone who looks like me in the room, we know that ethnic match, racial match doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to nail it all the time. Right? So really keeping on top of your own bias and staying self-aware is really key.
What do you want the South Asian community to know about trauma? So if somebody's watching this and they're seeing you and thinking about seeking out care, what would you like them to know?
That's a good question. I think I'd want them to know that even if you haven't maybe been in a war or been through a car accident or something like that. I think people think that trauma has to be used only for situations that are so extreme in that way, right? Like it has to be rape. It has to be something so earth-shattering in a way, in a one-time thing, that's when you're allowed to use that term. But trauma can be so many things. It can be coming from childhood neglect, witnessing domestic violence. It can be from intergenerational trauma, multiple places over years that start to really wear down in the way that you think and the way that you feel. And so I think having more understanding of the complexities of the word trauma, I think I'd want them to know you're allowed to come in for therapy, even if you haven't been in this traumatized in this classic way maybe you've been taught to think about. I'd also want them to know that there are some topics that maybe in your families were not allowed to be talked about. Sex, sexuality, good touch, bad touch. And so if something happened to you that was sexually related, that was traumatic, therapy can be a place to really start to put language to it. And it's a place where you don't have to hide it or feel ashamed. And so what a special place to have when you've never been given the language before. And so therapy can be a place where you sort of reparenting yourself and redoing those conversations or having them for the first time with yourself. Those are terms, sex, sexuality, premarital sex that are so taboo in the traditional South Asian home. And I remember even growing up watching Bollywood movies where there was no kissing, there was no sex, there was no, revealing of the bodies in these certain ways. And so that can have an impact on how people understand sexual trauma that happens to their bodies. And so therapy, again, I think is a place where we can try to make some shifts to that.
The words that I'm picking up on were permission. I'm not sure if you said it, but the words that I felt were permission. You're allowed to get therapy. This is something that you're allowed to do for yourself. And also to expand your rigid and narrow definition of what's traumatic. It's traumatic because it feels distressing and traumatic to you, not because of some definition on a paper, but because of the way it's impacting you, what happened to you, all of those things. That just feels like an invitation. And that was lovely. That was really lovely. So much of what survivors can tend to do is compare their experiences with others. Well, mine wasn't bad because X didn't happen, or somebody else had it worse. And so I don't deserve to feel this way.
Absolutely. I've had people say to me, I feel bad for taking up this slot. I'm doing okay. I'm sure you have people that have it a lot worse. And I'll ask them, who said that to you? And they'll have to really think over it. And it clicks that they were told for many, many years growing up, other people have it worse. What do you have to complain about? Other people have it worse. What are you so depressed about? Or therapy is for, white people. We're not like them. Why do you think you deserve to be like them? Or we don't want to be like them. We're Indian or we're South Asian. Don't try to be like them. But that's coming from, another generation's fear of something they don't understand. And I think a fear of also losing their children to a culture that they immigrated to, but they don't quite understand and they're scared of in some ways.
At the root of those unhelpful thoughts is often a voice from their childhood, something from the past. It's rarely their or your voice. And so when you can identify it as, oh, I heard that early on, and then I took it, right? I took ownership of it. It means that you can give ownership back. If you took it, you can give it right back. And that's powerful. That can be really powerful.
That's a good way to put it.
This has been so enlightening and such a gentle conversation about something that can be so difficult to talk about. And so I just appreciate you for that. Thank you for being in this space with me.
Thank you. You too. It's so rare that I feel like I get to sit down and really think about what's happening in my community. I think about it all the time in here, and I'm always witnessing it and picking it up and processing it by myself. But to sit with another human being, another female, another person of color who's in the field and sort of reflect what's happening in a time of a global trauma right now too, I think is cathartic and really special for me as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Are there any resources that you often share with people that you want to share here today?
I'm thinking about professional resources. I found that a lot of my clients are professionals who are doing very well, meeting that stereotype of doing really well in their specific careers. And I think they sometimes forget that their companies, their institutions, their hospitals, there are resources for therapy, for coaching, for self-care that they can use. I've had many people say, but I'm doing fine, I don't need that. But I'm really doing really well in my career. I don't think I need more than that. But I always, ask back, what if you could do even better in your career by using these resources that are available? And they clearly exist because there are people like you that need them. But I think they've been kept as a secret because we're in this, again, these masked environments where we think we're not supposed to use them, but they exist because there are clearly people behind the scenes using them and needing them. So I would say, in whichever profession you're in or institution you work for, seek them out, use them. I think that will bolster your efficacy and productivity in your workplace and also support you when you go home and to be a better parent, better partner, and a more nourished person. I would also suggest exploring books, articles. They're out there. South Asian mental health is starting to really blossom right now. It's been beautiful to see the number of books and movies and articles I'm seeing in the past decade. In grad school, this, like I was saying before, it wasn't the case, but it's out there now. I'm finding there are South Asian specific organizations in every state. There are domestic violence shelters. There are resources, listservs specifically for South Asian mental health. So that's something you can Google and find far more readily now.
Wonderful. Are you working on any projects that you're excited about? You mentioned that you just opened a private practice, which is really exciting, and it sounds like thriving.
It is. It's going well. I opened the private practice up about 2.5 years ago, and I was wanting to serve communities of color in Chicago, in downtown Chicago. But I'm actually starting to refine my population to hone in on the South Asian population some more. I don't think I had the confidence to do that before, thinking, are there people who are going to be seeking help with South Asians? It's so taboo in our community. It's really going to happen. But I would say over 60% of my clients are South Asian right now. And so that's really empowered me to want to serve my community some more. And so I'm refining my private practice population of focus. I'm writing a book chapter right now on gender socialization in the South Asian community. I have an Instagram account, SNK_therapy, that is, I'm retooling and I'm reworking to, again, provide more South Asian focused content. And I'm actually opening up my time to not just be for therapy, but I'm trying to also reach a larger audience now. I find I love therapy and it's one-on-one. And so I'm trying to find ways to reach larger audiences. So I'll be providing workshops, providing consultation. So if anyone has interest in that, feel free to message me directly via Instagram, and we can talk over how I can serve your community, family, temple, workplace, some more.
Well, we'll have all that information at the end of the episode so that people can find you. We're just so happy that you're sharing your gifts. The community is going to be better for it. We're really excited. And I love that you shared that piece about, not knowing or feeling like you were stepping out a little on faith in terms of broadening your practice or narrowing your practice and taking a leap. I have found that when you're doing something that you're passionate about and you're doing it from a place of service, it works out. So I'm really glad to have another piece of evidence for that.
It does. It's crazy. Like, even as I was thinking about that, you and I reconnected and things have just been falling into place. Or as I've been, speaking about it some more without worrying about what people will think. There's a common Hindi phrase in Hindi is an Indian language that I've seen more and more in some South Asian T-shirts and sweatshirts and from people of my generation, right, who are starting to own what that word, that phrase means. Log kya kahenge? That means, what do people think? And I found that has been in the background of so many of my clients when they come to see me. But I realized that part of it was also buzzing the back of my mind about, what do people think if I go into just a South Asian focused practice? Or what do people think if I have to explain to my parents' friends what I do? Because I remember saying what I did years ago, and they would say, but we don't have that in our community. That doesn't happen in our community, right? And so there's been some, I think, avoidance of having to have those conversations over and over again. But now I'm actually excited to have those conversations, to say they do. And I really wish that we could talk about it. They do happen, all of it: addiction, sexual trauma, sexual abuse, domestic violence, depression, anxiety. They do. That's why I'm here. And my doors are being knocked on all the time because of it. So yeah, I agree. I think once you put it out there, the universe brings all these opportunities and all these people to have a more synchronous experience.
So hopefully by talking more about it and uncovering and releasing people from stigma and shame, we will begin to facilitate recovery faster and help people stop that intergenerational transmission of trauma and begin to stop some painful cycles.
So hope across time.
Thank you, Shanta, and thank you everybody for tuning in to another episode of Thriving in Change with Dr. Norcott. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Take care. Bye.